I said it is important to know how to evaluate arguments because bad arguments, although they might not tell us anything, can lead us astray. So now I want us to look more carefully at notions of deductive validity first and inductive strength. Let's start with deductive validity. An argument is deductively valid if and only if there is no possible situation in which its premises are true and its conclusion false. A counterexample is such a situation that makes the premises true and the conclusion false in the case of a valid argument. The existence of a counterexample, therefore, demonstrates the invalidity of the argument. Let's take an example. Premise 1. It is wrong to kill an innocent. An embryo is an innocent one of us. Premise 3. In therapeutic cloning, an embryo is killed. Then the conclusion is that therapeutic cloning is wrong. Or consider the following example. Premise 1. The right action is the action that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Premise 2. Therapeutic cloning produces the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Conclusion. Therapeutic cloning is right. Both arguments are deductively valid, so if their premises are true, then so must be their conclusions. Assuming you think the premises are at least plausible, either of these arguments would be a good place to start to convince someone else of your point of view, namely that therapeutic cloning is right or wrong, respectively. However, notice that the conclusions of the two valid arguments are contradictory, so we seem to have two deductively valid arguments supporting contradictory conclusions. The solution to this apparent dilemma is to point out that perhaps only one of the two arguments is also deductively sound. So all its premises are true. This implies that at least one of the premises in one of the two arguments is false. This type of case should make us clear that a valid argument can have a false conclusion. People often find this surprising. This is usually because they have confused the notion of validity with the notion of truth, and perhaps the notion of soundness. But remember, sentences or propositions, premises and conclusion are true or false, whereas deductive arguments are valid or invalid. Valid arguments with only true premises are sound arguments. Valid deductive arguments with at least one false premise are unsound. The fact that an argument is deductively valid gives us two pieces of information. 1. If the premises of this argument are true, the conclusion must be true as well. And 2. If the conclusion of the argument is false, then at least one of the premises is false. So, if we made a valid argument and if we accept the premises, then we have to accept the conclusion. If we reject the conclusion, we know we must examine the premises to find the error. Because a valid argument can have a false conclusion, we should never believe a conclusion simply because it is the conclusion of a valid argument. We need to be especially aware of this trap in reasoning if we are inclined to accept the conclusion in the first place, or in its own terms. In fact, whenever we are antecedently prepared to accept the conclusion of an argument, we should be extra vigilant, both in checking the argument is really good and that its premises are true. There are also other situations, other than the falsity of one or more of the premises, when the validity of an argument should not persuade us of the truth of its conclusion. Circular arguments and beg the question arguments are valid arguments whose conclusion nevertheless should not be accepted. Circular arguments and beg the question arguments are just two types of instances of a common fallacy, so common logical error one makes in reasoning. Fallacies are bad arguments that can easily pass for good arguments. There are many types of fallacies, and some of them can be persuasive because they are valid arguments, just as we saw with circular and beg the question arguments. Some because they're easily mistaken for valid ones. Make sure to check the list of the most common types of fallacy one encounters in day-to-day reasoning as well as in ethical reasoning. Now, let's have a closer look to the notion of inductive strength and how inductive arguments should be analyzed. There are different types of inductive arguments: analogies, arguments for authority, and generalizations, including causal generalizations. Remember, we said that inductive strength is not a binary issue. It's not an either-or matter, as just validity is. An inductive argument is good to the extent that the truth of its premises raises the likelihood of the truth of its conclusion. And it's bad to the extent that the truth of the premises doesn't raise the likelihood of the truth of its conclusion. Evaluating inductive argument is, in many ways, a much more subtle procedure than evaluating deductive arguments. The best way to evaluate whether the conclusion of an inductive argument follows from its premises is to answer a set of 3 questions. In answering these questions, one gets a feel for how inductively strong the argument is. These are the questions. From a sample of which population is the argument extrapolating to the rest of the population? Is the extrapolation reasonable? Question number 2. Can we question the premises of the argument? Question number 3. Can we undermine the similarity claim underlying the extrapolation? So in evaluating inductive arguments, one should be aware that different people have different levels of inductive boldness. Some people are prepared to extrapolate from a very small sample and on the grounds of a very tenuous similarity, while others require a large sample and a very significant similarity. The larger the sample from which we extrapolate, the stronger the similarity on the basis of which we extrapolate, and the more reasonable the extrapolation, the stronger our argument is going to be. I want to conclude on a brief note about an important principle in argumentation. Now, as philosophers, our job is to listen to arguments and subject them to criticism. We'll kind of question the conclusion by questioning the premises and asking whether the conclusion follows from the premises. This is what we'll talk about in this lecture. If we view bioethics as a branch of philosophy, then it's pretty much our job in thinking about bioethical issues to evaluate arguments. One will construct arguments and evaluate them, whether they are good, bad, what are the premises, and how the premises support the conclusion. I also want to point out that in working with one another, the best way to learn is by arguing with one another and by criticizing others' arguments. But it's not always nice to have your carefully constructed argument criticized. Many people, being afraid of this, refuse to argue in the first place. They rather stay silent than make themselves vulnerable to being questioned on the reasons for believing a certain thing. This is particularly common when people are learning how to construct and evaluate arguments. And in fact, no matter how confident you are, however keen on offering your opinions, you might find that you become oddly shy when you're expected to argue for your opinions, knowing that your arguments will not be taken at face value, but rather put to the test. Avoiding such a situation is important, especially in collective pursuits of truth, like in philosophy or in science. Because in these situations, we want as many arguments as possible on the table, so we want to avoid people being too shy or too afraid of their arguments being criticized ruthlessly. In the hope of guaranteeing this collective pursuit of truth, most philosophers try to observe an ethical principle in their argumentation. This is the principle of charity, which says that you should always treat the appearance of falsehood, irrationality, or stupidity on the part of others as evidence of your own misunderstanding of their argument, and for the need to try harder to understand what it is they are saying and why they are saying it. As philosopher Quine said, your interlocutor's silliness is less likely than your bad interpretation. So there are 2 big reasons for abiding by the principle of charity. The principle of charity is meant to help us discover when we are the ones saying something false, irrational, or stupid. And it should prevent us from falling victim to our own prejudices. By invoking charity in argument, one tests one's own beliefs and arguments. Because it's only by properly testing these that one is justified in thinking that one's beliefs are truth and the arguments good.